Long live Palestine!
Long live Palestine!
Long live Palestine!
Free Palestine!
We have chosen to block the road to Pine Gap US military facility because of their direct involvement in supporting the Israeli genocide of Palestinian people.
Shame.
Shame. Palestinian civilians.
Shame.
Palestinian children.
Shame.
Hospitals.
Shame.
Convoys.
Shame.
Ambulances.
Alice Springs nurse Jem Walsh is all in black, sitting cross-legged on a green checkered blanket in the middle of the bitumen road that leads to the spy base in my backyard. But this is no picnic. One of Jem's arms is trapped inside a large steel drum that's been splashed with red paint to symbolise blood. The drum is full of concrete. It's immovable. A small group of 20 or so protesters hold signs that read, "Free Palestine" and "Stop arming genocide." The road to Pine Gap has been blocked for hours.
These are war crimes and we refuse to be complicit in it, and we call on the Australian government to take a stance.
These are serious accusations that Pine Gap spying means Australia is involved in war between Israel and Gaza.
Today we offer the Mourner's Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. Yit Gadal V'yit Kadash Shemei Rabbah Balma Divrach Hirutei V'amlich Malkutei.
One struggle, one fight. Long live Palestine.
So is there anything to them? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to a world before two planes smashed into two very important buildings in New York. We need to know what happened next.
Protesters had hoped the end of the Cold War meant an end to this secret Outback spy base, 18 k's from Alice Springs. But it didn't. New capabilities had cemented Pine Gap's place in Australia. Like a giant vacuum, more antennas and more satellites were sucking up intelligence to feed the US military machine. Born from a lie in the Cold War, it put Australia in the nuclear crosshairs through the 70s and 80s. But is there something even more sinister going on at Pine Gap now?
More than ever, I want to know what on earth is happening in my backyard. I'm Alex Barwick, and this is the final episode of Expanse, Spies in the Outback, The Secrets of Pine Gap. After a shift at the base, David Rosenberg, the Pine Gap guy who dreamt of being a spy ever since he saw Mission Impossible as a kid, caught the bus home, ate dinner, and later that night, headed back into the lounge room and flicked on the news.
Horror beyond description on a New York morning.
It's that day in September 2001.
First one plane crashes into a tower of the World Trade Center, then another.
I turn on the TV and I see the towers on fire, and it looks surreal. I actually didn't know if this was some kind of a movie I was watching, a fictional movie. The first tower had not fallen yet. It was actually still burning. So really the first thing I did was get on the phone and called a friend of mine back in the States and talked about it with him.
This day is burnt into the global consciousness in a way few others are. Terrorists hijacked 4 planes and smashed 2 of them into 2 of the world's tallest buildings at the time, the Twin Towers. The others went into the Pentagon and crashed into a field. Thousands died. And America had been completely caught off guard.
We were 100% surprised at Pine Gap. Nobody knew this was coming. We had no clue. It was assessed to be an intelligence failure. And everybody's relatives were asking them, oh, you work at Pine Gap, what can you tell us? And the truth is, we said, just keep watching CNN. I could not get to sleep. So I had stayed up the entire night, and the next morning I caught the bus into work. The driver had the sound up turned rather loudly so that everybody could hear the news of what was happening with 9/11.
Immediately, it was clear things were changing.
All of the facilities everywhere had been placed on heightened alert. They were searching everybody. Every car had to be searched as well. So security was so heightened at that time that it took a long time to get into the facility.
Finally, inside Pine Gap, David was briefed. The war on terror had begun. The hunt for those responsible was on, and Pine Gap was more important than ever to find them.
because we believe it's Al-Qaeda, and we're looking at them as a possible target for some kind of retaliation. So we're surveilling the country, finding out where the weapons are, where the communications are, who's saying what to who.
Bombs rained down on Afghanistan and then on Iraq. How important would you describe Pine Gap's role, while not offensive, but in carefully trying to locate terrorists and military targets?
Oh, that's always done with the utmost accuracy.
Often when I ask David specific questions about Pine Gap's role in any war, the answers are vague, even when I push back. He's always been careful not to reveal classified information. Basically, he wants it known Pine Gap's not technically responsible for attacking other countries. But from what he says, the intel it provides does inform the US exactly where to drop the bombs.
Airstrike upon airstrike. Estimates vary wildly, but some calculations say more than 150,000 people were killed in Iraq, and the majority were civilians. But David Rosenberg wants it to be clear. He was never personally responsible for firing off a missile.
We simply gather intelligence and pass that over to military planners to do what they need to do, and will always do what they can to minimize any kind of loss of life. From my own perspective of being on the inside, I do know that Pine Gap's mission is certainly a peaceful one.
It might have felt peaceful in an air-conditioned room on the outskirts of Alice Springs, but as the war on terror dragged on, it felt anything but peaceful in a noisy and crowded hospital in Afghanistan.
The room in the ward where Bilal was recovering had a big window that faced out into a quadrangle of some sort. He was sitting on a hospital bed with a couple of his uncles and cousins who were consoling him.
Photojournalist Andrew Quilty had travelled to Jalalabad in eastern Afghanistan. He sat with 12-year-old Bilal as an uncle gently placed a hand on the boy's head.
He had the pants of his traditional Parantamban on, but his top was removed so the medical staff could dress his wounds, and he was clearly in a state somewhere between shock and mourning. He was visibly upset, crying, and in the early stages of grieving for his father.
Bilal had just seen his father killed in a drone strike. He survived with shrapnel wounds. Bandages covered his torso, shoulder and foot.
He had been there at the time of the attack, asleep, and his father had been among those who had been killed.
And what did they tell you about what had unfolded that night?
They had been there to celebrate the return of a local elder coming back from the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, which is a very common reason for celebration in Afghanistan.
The target was in Shadal Bazaar, a poor rural village set beneath mountains that soar so high they're often covered in snow. The roads are lined with irrigated fields. The bazaar is a hub for basic groceries, meat and petrol.
The men had long since bunked down for the night. They had celebrated with the slaughtering of a sheep or a goat and cooked that, as is a customary way of celebrating in Afghanistan.
They went to bed, and at around 3:30 a.m, the silence was shattered.
They were all either awakened or instantly killed by this explosion from a drone.
The war on terror and retaliation for the deadliest attack on American soil was unrelenting. It became a global campaign, Australia in lockstep with the US. And it was still going on in September of 2016, when Andrew Quilty met Bilal and other drone strike survivors who travelled from this small village to Jalalabad for medical treatment.
The US military had claimed that it had been an ISIS target, but the United Nations in Afghanistan had come out pretty quickly refuting that claim and saying that it had been civilians that had been killed.
By now, Andrew had spent a fair bit of time in hospitals across Afghanistan, capturing the stories of civilians caught up in this nebulous war on terror.
One sure way of identifying someone as purely a civilian is by their age. And Bilal was, from memory, 12 years old at the time, and there was simply no way that he could have been anything other than a civilian.
The US increasingly used targeted drone strikes, particularly in remote areas. Why? To minimise loss of life. There is no way of confirming whether Pine Gap's intel led to Bilal's village being targeted by a drone missile.
Not without someone getting in a whole lot of trouble, like locked up as a traitor trouble. But it's clear from the spy on the inside, David Rosenberg, that this secret place in the Australian outback had its eyes and ears on the Middle East, finding terrorists and intelligence for targets. While all this was going on, there'd been a young American on the inside working for the NSA, the National Security Agency, the ones responsible for all the listening, the spying. And he was a far greater threat to the secrets hidden in the ranges surrounding my desert town. His name was Edward Snowden. And a few years earlier, he'd shocked the world by leaking a bunch of classified NSA documents.
I'd read a little bit about Pine Gap in some of the releases of the Edward Snowden archive that were published in papers around the world.
Australian journalist Peter Crono found himself looking through these incredibly technical but revealing documents.
I thought, well, maybe there's more.
So he asked.
The Edward Snowden archive people said nobody had previously asked for documents on Pine Gap. Lo and behold, there were a number of documents that were to do with Pine Gap, and they were very interesting.
Whistleblower Edward Snowden was responsible for the biggest intelligence leak of NSA documents in American history. He's now living in exile in Russia to escape the consequences that await him in the US.
Anyway, back then, there was mention of Pine Gap in the reporting, but 4 years later, in 2017, Peter Crono was digging deeper.
And in one part of it, it refers to the defence facility at Pine Gap playing a significant role in supporting military operations. It was a documented reference to actual involvement in battlefield operations, into military operations, and that is the involvement of Pine Gap in battlefield communication and battlefield detection of targets.
It confirmed what a lot of people already suspected, but it was confirmation from the inside that Pine Gap is identifying targets, people and places, to be killed and destroyed by bombs from drones. Which makes me wonder again whether the spy base in my backyard was involved in the attack on Bilal's family in Shadal Bazaar, Afghanistan.
Some people laud Edward Snowden for finally revealing Pine Gap's secrets, but our spy David Rosenberg is not a fan.
People have asked me, is he a whistleblower or is he a traitor? I would call Edward Snowden a traitor, simply because, like me, he is obliged to protect everything that he knew that was classified for the rest of his life. And I think he did the wrong thing. What I'm talking about there is particularly the information that he released on Pine Gap. I will never reveal anything that's classified. Everything I've told you today is not classified.
And you'll take the rest to your grave?
Oh, yes, I will. I will take the rest to my grave.
I ask if he shares Edward Snowden's concerns that sometimes innocent civilians are killed or injured, like Bilal.
I don't think about that because the intention of all of the signals that we go after are to mitigate us. We want to make sure that we got the right information. What we want to do at Pine Gap is to mitigate the loss of life unnecessarily.
And maybe Pine Gap's intelligence does reduce civilian deaths. But from what Andrew Quilty saw in the hospitals of Afghanistan, a lot of innocent people are dying. But they're out of sight, often unreported.
Do you ever feel any kind of conflict personally about the work that Pine Gap's involved in?
Absolutely none.
Journalist Peter Crono, like most people I've spoken to, used to live in Alice Springs. He worked for the Aboriginal Land Council in the 1990s, and it was actually an exchange with an American that turned his attention to Pine Gap in the first place. He noticed the guy's accent and so asked,
Do you work at Pine Gap? And he said, well, yes, I do. And I said, oh, that's fascinating. What do you do out there? He said, well, I can't tell you. And I said, oh, okay, well, just generally, what sort of things? I'm not prepared to tell you. He got very serious. I pressed him because I thought, well, this is, 15 k's away from where I was standing. And he ended up saying to me, listen, there's some things that you don't need to know.
That was the line that did it.
I often think back to it because why are there secrets that we shouldn't know? What are they? And why can't the public have some say over what it is we can and can't know?
These are the same questions I keep coming back to. I've heard some pretty strong arguments on both sides of the Pine Gap debate, but the extreme secrecy means it's almost impossible to consider what's right or wrong with having this spy base in the outback. And maybe that's the point. I still have former Defence Minister Kim Beazley's laughter ringing in my ears from when I asked him what he found out about Pine Gap.
As though I'm going to tell you.
Despite this, unlike so many others I've spoken to, Peter Chrono doesn't want Pine Gap shut down.
There's definitely extremely valid roles for the facilities at Pine Gap to be able to do. Early warning, for example, of terrorism. It has a role in supporting Australian defence operations, for example, peacekeeping in East Timor or Bougainville. It has a role in protecting us from criminal hacking or commercial espionage.
But even so, because Pine Gap's part of a huge network and any one piece of intelligence can pass through so many hands before it's used, he says its current way of operating is problematic.
This raises one of the huge conundrums for Pine Gap, and that is just who is responsible for a child's death in some battlefield if a weapon using intelligence from Pine Gap, if it goes wrong? Who's responsible?
Intelligence from Pine Gap isn't used in isolation. The US has bases around the world. Most aren't eavesdropping and finding targets like Pine Gap, but together they're formidable. Each person is just doing their job, like cogs in a wheel. But just who is responsible in the kill chain when it goes wrong? Peter is one of the few Australian journalists to write about Pine Gap and the Israel-Gaza war that began in late 2023.
I saw the first vision of the Hamas attack on just the nightly news, vision of people being killed by Hamas, and the gut reaction is horror. I didn't know what was going to happen. I expected a retaliation. Boy, what we've seen, I've never seen anything like this before.
Could this be the end of peace for a generation? Those are the fears of many on both sides of the fence as the IDF prepares to deliver what it's described as mighty vengeance on Hamas.
Well, it's obvious to me that Pine Gap's involved. The satellites Pine Gap uses, the Orions that sit over Europe and Africa and the Middle East, they're pouring information in. There's no doubt about it. When a hotspot starts up, like Ukraine or Gaza, of course, the base focuses on that and gets tasked by the NSA and others to pursue certain locations and people.
This is what prompted that nurse to trap an arm inside a steel drum and block the road to Pine Gap. The fear that through Pine Gap, we're seriously involved in the war. I checked with David Rosenberg, the guy who actually worked there. David, is Pine Gap monitoring the Gaza Strip and surrounding areas?
You would have to think so. It is an area where there is some military conflict going on at the moment, and Pine Gap does have a role in monitoring those kind of situations. And the conflict would be of interest to the United States.
Do you mean potentially locating targets for retaliation?
Well, not necessarily for retaliation, but monitoring targets and just gathering intelligence.
But it could be potentially for locating targets.
Well, that's one of the things that the satellites do.
But is the US sharing its intelligence with Israel? We don't know. And even if we could show they are, we don't know what intelligence or how it's being used in the war. But Peter Chrono says there is a long history of sharing intelligence with Israel. Basically, there are precedents.
The NSA signed an agreement about 10 years ago with ISNU. ISNU's the Israeli Signet National Unit, and it agreed to hand over all sorts of signals intelligence. So anything in the networked world that we provide to the NSA is available for the NSA to provide to Israel.
But it's really hard to pin down specifically. Is Pine Gap 100% providing targets in Gaza to Israel?
I haven't got evidence that shows that they're locating exact targets where Hamas is in Gaza. I've seen the information that the capability exists.
On any ordinary day in Alice Springs, taking the kids to school or heading to the shops, I've been thinking about this curtain of silence that shrouds Pine Gap, about the people I play sport with or parents of my kids' friends who'll never speak about their work. And I don't ask. But the thing is, this place is quite literally built on secrets. The large white radomes don't just hide what direction the antennas inside are pointing in. The whole complex behind razor wire hides the secrets of the stolen land beneath. I eventually had a coffee with Ken Napier, the head of Pine Gap Security. He'd reached out after our exchange at Pine Gap's gates with protesters Sue and Jenny from the 1983 peace camp. I can't share much of what he said, but there were a few things. He talked about the family of dingoes that's lived on the base for generations. But the other thing he said was that there were Aboriginal paintings on rock overhangs within the fence line. It sent shivers down my spine. Talk about the most secure rock art in Australia.
On a warm December day, Aranda elder Felicity Hayes stands on a patch of red sand. Kangaroo grass grows at her feet. Pine trees and ironwoods surround us.
Wada, inga pachigao, mbarakat na pachigao pan, ajak, nana tak pachigao, wana na pachanyat, apmajak.
Felicity was a teenager the first time she came to Coimbra.
I was about 14 years old when I first came here with my granddad and my dad and my auntie and my mum. For me as a young teenager, didn't even know about sacred sites and everything, you know. Since I come here, it just opened up to me. We are going towards the women's area. Sacred site is a special place for us that can't let anybody come in and destroy anything. Even trees, even the plants, you can't move a rock. Sacred site is a place that you can't touch anything. Well, I felt like our space was invaded, you know. Invaded by people that never really looked at the land closely.
I can see a camera high on the other side of the Pine Gap fence watching us.
What sort of interactions have you had with security arriving over the years when you've come and spent time here?
Oh, they ask you a lot of questions. What are you doing here? Who are you, you know? How come you come here, you know?
I asked Felicity what she knows about the rock art Ken mentioned. There are actually paintings on both sides of the barbed wire fence protecting Pine Gap.
Big wall painting, got chiseled out, and that's why we was like, we had to come and check it out.
One of the paintings has actually been removed.
So what had happened?
They took our story, you know. It belongs to our country, it belongs to us. I feel sort of angry and sad. That was our history, that was our story of when old people lived here a long time ago. Before the white men came, you know. The rock art is a story. It's a history story.
A museum in Darwin, 1,500 kilometres away, has confirmed that they do have cultural objects from the Pine Gap site removed during an archaeological dig. I can't confirm whether this includes the rock art Felicity spoke about. But her grandfather went to see the damage to the painting. He came home angry.
You wanted to kill somebody. You wanted to spare that person, whoever he was,
There's been a roller coaster of resistance to Pine Gap and the role it plays in America's wars. But right here in Alice Springs and Buntua, the enduring loss over many generations for Felicity's family must be heartbreaking. As I drive back into town, the Pine Gap prohibited area sign in my rearview mirror, I realise this spy base makes me feel small. Its reach and power is enormous. It's why a lot of people in my town of 25,000 just can't talk about what they do. Ever. And if they do, they'll be evacuated overnight, or worse. Maybe it's no surprise no one speaks out. We know what happened to Edward Snowden, now stuck living in Russia, and other whistleblowers like Julian Assange, forced to take refuge in the London Ecuadorian embassy for 7 years, then incarcerated and fighting extradition for years. Heading back to the office, Piggly's supermarket is on my right. It's a reminder of the serious dollars that flowed into the town when the base was first built. Even now, a lot of people and local businesses would suffer if those antennas were ever powered down. But that's not likely. Because Pine Gap's bigger than Alice Springs. Not that the Australian government is giving anything away. I reached out anyway, asking for an interview with the Defence Minister, Richard Marles. I also asked to go inside the gates of Pine Gap. My requests were politely declined in less than 2 hours. In the 16 years I've lived in Alice Springs, it's always been radio silence or a one-liner. The government can't comment on matters of national security. I wrote back to the Defence Department anyway, with about 30 questions, asking everything from whether Pine Gap was supplying Israel with targets in Gaza to what plans were in place for further expansion. And for the first time, I actually got a few paragraphs back, but not answering the questions I'd asked. They repeated that sentiment. Australia's cooperation with the United States through joint and collaborative facilities is one of our most long-standing security arrangements. By necessity and in accordance with long-standing practice by successive governments, we do not comment on the operation of our joint facilities, including Pine Gap. Everything I've learnt about Pine Gap only leaves me wanting to know more. Goes with the job. I think most of us accept that governments eavesdrop on one another to gather intelligence. But the scale and use of Pine Gap's intelligence by governments outside Australia without the public knowing, and for use in conflicts with countries we are not at war with, it doesn't feel very democratic. Does the Australian public deserve to know more, to have a say, or even be part of a public conversation? It's reasonable to ask questions and get answers, especially when the implications are so serious, deadly. And while the sign on the road to this Outback spy base says it's joint, is it really an equal partnership when one party is a hell of a lot more powerful than the other? And if our strategic interests don't align with the United States, can we disentangle ourselves? Or is our ever closer relationship with America the only thing that will save us if there's conflict in our region? Revealing state secrets or putting national security at risk has never been my aim. But we should know more about this secret place in the Outback that's shaped my town. We should know more about what it's got Australia into. And that if nuclear war broke out, Alice Springs and Buntua could well be blown off the map. So what exactly is going on in my backyard? More than I could have ever imagined. Large-scale spying and surveillance around the world, intelligence used in America's military kill chain, and sacred sites on stolen land. And I still feel like I don't know the half of it. My name's Alex Barwick. This is Expanse Season 3, Spies in the Outback.